Welcome, and it's good to see you again, even if it's not face-to-face. Today I want to take 5 or 10 minutes to talk about Paul's missionary journeys, give you some idea of the geography and distances and dangers involved. Then I want to take you on a very, very quick tour of ancient Corinth and Ephesus to give you some idea of the important geographic features, as well as some idea of really the high levels of culture that they had. And then finally, I want to look at the typical house of a rich person in Hellenistic society and talk a little bit about how the design of that house plays out in the culture of the first century and in the early church, specifically some of Paul's comments about the Lord's Supper and how that it happens in the first century. So join me. This will be mostly screen captures. And again, let me know if this works for you or if there's something that needs to be changed. Thanks. This is a picture of the Mediterranean Sea, Israel down here in the south, and of course Antioch up here. And it's a picture of Paul's first missionary journey. And I'll zoom out just a little bit so you can get a better picture of what's going on. And start his first missionary journey. You notice that he'll leave from Antioch. And as we look at this journey, one of the first things I want you to understand is this is not a short journey. It involves dangerous sea travel. Now, at this point in the first century, sea travel was possible, but not safe all the time. Not so much because of pirates, as it would have been 100 years before, but just because of the weather. And you have a definite season of sailing in the Mediterranean from March to about October, November. And that's the only time you can sail. In fact, if you think of the book of Acts, when Paul is finally taken to Rome, he tells the captain or the skipper not to go because it's past a safe sailing season, and lo and behold, he does have a shipwreck. So again, as I let's look, for instance, at Paul's second missionary journey. Perhaps give you a little bit better idea. Paul is traveling thousands of miles, both by ship and overland. And we kind of gloss over that today in age of airplanes and things like that. But think what would happen if I ask you to tomorrow leave home and take everything you needed to carry on your back and walk to Houston. Think about the commitment that would take, the dangers involved, the time and expense. I mean, certainly just traveling, there's no expense in walking, but you have food, you might have to rent rooms, you have to replace stuff along the way, and certainly people on these long sailing trips, as you see here, coming back to Jerusalem, they charged a lot of money for that. So Paul's missionary journeys were not something that were undertaken lightly. They were something that took a lot of time, a lot of effort, and were really lifelong commitments to Paul. You notice in the course of many, many years, he only makes 3 missionary journeys. And when he gets to a large city like Ephesus or something like that, he stays there for a while. Now let me just point out one thing, and we'll go into this more in detail as we get through the class, but right in here is Corinth. This is Greece, and you notice there's a large peninsula here in Greece attached to the rest of Greece by a little narrow neck, and Corinth is right on that neck. If I zoom out some more, I'll show you the main thing that drove all travel and commerce in the Mediterranean was grain shipments to Italy. Rome is up here, and the grain growing region of the world was down here along the Nile Delta. Rome could not feed itself. They were absolutely dependent on grain imports from Egypt. So all during the sailing season, you had a constant stream of these huge grain ships that would go from Egypt around the Greece peninsula and then to Rome and then come back unloaded to pick up more grain. So you can kind of see that what Paul is doing is catching a ride on those grain ships back and forth. Now, one of the problems the grain ships had was getting around this cape right here. It's a very dangerous cape. In fact, the little rhyme in the first century was, pass this cape 3 times and die. And what that meant is every time you went past that cape, you had a 1 in 3 chance of dying because of weather, shipwreck, something like that. So very, very dangerous. But what people discovered was they could take the grain ships or the barges or the other things, come up here through the islands and actually get into Corinth, and I'll zoom in there, and what they would do is they would unload their ships in Corinth and be able to avoid that dangerous isthmus or that dangerous cape. If you excuse me while I hone in here a little bit more to give you an idea of the geography involved, you start to see that that cape or that isthmus, is really very, very narrow. And it was so narrow and it was so dangerous going around that cape. As we get closer, you can see that it is very, very narrow. That ships would come in here, they would actually offload in the port of Chinchilla. They would put their cargo on little flat bottom boats or wheelbarrow kind of things, haul them, load them, drag them across the isthmus, reload the ships in Corinth in a different ship, and then the ship would go on to Rome. The other way, the ship would come in, it would unload in Corinth, they would drag it over that isthmus, reload it in Chinchilla, and then send it on back to Egypt. So when we talk about Corinth, why it was a center of commerce and culture and everything else, and why Paul spent so much time there, it really was at the crossroads of the first century world, almost like the Panama Canal or something like that today. So as we pull back and look at the Mediterranean, think about the time, distance, and dangers involved in Paul and his journeys. I'd like to give you some kind of overview of Corinth and Ephesus. And actually what we're looking at here is the Ephesus Canal. It was finally dug in the last couple of hundred years after Napoleon, but it was dreamed of as early as the ancient Greeks. I think Herod tried it, Nero tried it, a lot of people tried it, but no one ever dug a Corinth Canal until recently. But you see that it did involve a lot of work. It's only about, I think, 9 miles across that isthmus, so it's fairly narrow. But you can see that actually the Greece is separated by this canal, and it's a picture of them towing a barge through the modern-day canal. But you can see that even today, time is saved by not having to go around that cape, so they use the canal, exactly like they would use the Panama Canal today. So a center of sea traffic, center of trade, and because of that, a center of culture, and a center of people making a lot of money. We'll talk about that later, how all the sea traffic and trade created the opportunity for lots of nouveau rich people. So in one way, Corinth was the Silicon Valley of the first century. A little bit about Ephesus. Ephesus was a center of culture. Now, Ephesus was a seaport again. Again, sea trade often brings a lot of money. And this is the main road up from the harbor to Ephesus. Now, in the first century, the columns would have been complete, and this would have been a wide, almost like an interstate down to the harbor. And it would have been probably a canopy over those columns. So you can see that even the entrance to Corinth, very, very high class. You notice this statue here, and you may see some other statues. Again, just lining the way. Think about 7th Avenue or whatever, or 5th Avenue coming into New York, or Wall Street, one of the main streets of the day. This was the main road into Ephesus. So Ephesus was not a small town. This is what's left of the main library in Ephesus. If you can think about how huge that might have been, and even just the very idea of having a whole building full of scrolls or books. You again get the idea that Ephesus, where Paul spent so much time, was not a backwater of the Roman Empire, and in some ways may even been a cultural jewel of the Roman Empire. So not only were books very, very important to the people of Ephesus, but also the theater. This is, again, coming up that main road and into town, the first thing you see is this main theater, where most of the town could gather to see comedies, tragedies, meet for various civic meetings. If you remember, again, in Acts, where Paul is taken to trial, this is probably where the trial happened of Paul in Ephesus. Again, now from the top of the theater looking down, you can see the theater. And again, if you've never been in one of these, the acoustics are arranged as such. The stage was actually here. It was a wooden platform here that was the stage. And some of the action would happen on the stage, some of the action would happen here. But this slant on the side, the acoustics are such that someone standing down here and speaking in a normal voice can be heard even up at the top of the seats. Again, the theater, the main road into Ephesus, you get an idea of how nice and wide and straight it is, and then the harbor in the distance. And another picture of the theater, just to give you some idea of how steep it is. And finally, this is a picture of Diana. And that's who Paul had trouble with in Ephesus. Now those are not breasts, those are eggs or acorns, but they indicate fertility. This happens to be a statue from the Vatican. But when they talk about images of her, something like this might have been the little silver graven images that they used. I want to switch over a little bit and give you an idea now of the houses of the first century. And just to start off with, houses in the first century, similar to what they did today, represented status and honor. So obviously the bigger house you had, the fancier house you had, the more status you had in the community. And the way your house appeared was very, very important. And the ideas of privacy were very, very different in the first century than they were today. So you'll notice here that this is actually someone's front door. So you're looking at a huge front door. And if you notice, the front door looks into the house. So in the first century, you might be walking by on the street. Here's a schematic diagram of a house. The street would be out here. You might be walking by the street here, and the street obviously is public territory. This is the front door. But the difference in the first century was that this was public space too, so that if you were walking by, you were expected to look into this house through this little passageway. There'd be a doorman right here to protect or keep you from getting in if you weren't one of the invited guests. But to look in the house and see this marvelous living room, almost a throne room. There'd be a little reflecting pond, and then typically the owner of the house would be sitting in a throne, a raised platform and a large chair here. And all of this was his business area. So if you were walking by, you were supposed to look in, be impressed with what a great throne and reflecting pool he had. If you knew him, you were expected to come in and speak a few words to him and then go on about your business. But this was all public space, so really considered almost out on the street. People could wander in as long as they were known to the house. Back in the very back is what we would normally consider public space today in our house, a kitchen or a dining room. But back here was the very, very private part of the house. This was a little interior park. I'll show you some pictures in a second. That was strictly for use of the family or very, very close friends. And the very most private part of the house would be back here in the dining room. And the very back would be where they would worship the household gods. So when Paul is talking about sharing meals or the Lord's Supper, he's not talking about the public part of the house. He's talking about the very most private part of the house where you would only invite your very, very closest friends or relatives. Now, all of a sudden, in the context of Corinth or the Lord's Supper, people who used to be slaves and would never mix with the family, because there's no mixing between slave and free people, all of a sudden are expected to be invited into the very heart of the house, the heart of the privacy, and share a love feast, the Lord's Supper, with the rich owners of the house. And you can see how that might cause problems, that the rich people who know each other, the tendency would be for them to get off work early, go in, start celebrating, get drunk, do the Lord's Supper. Then as the poorer people came in, because this room only held 9 to 12 people, the poorer people would have to sit out here in the park, still very nice, but they would be separated from the rich people. And if the food was already gone, they wouldn't necessarily be anything to eat and drink. So what Paul is saying in the context of Corinth is the rich people can't have their Lord's Supper and let the poor people get the leavings. They all need to gather together and celebrate the Lord's Supper publicly. One other thing I wanted to give you an indication of, there are no bedrooms here. You couldn't tell by the abbreviations. But again, sleeping areas are not what we think about sleeping areas. Sleeping areas is just where you kept a pad rolled up on the floor or a bed in a room. And again, could be here in the public areas. So the owner of the house might sleep here during the night and then roll up his bed and then make this all public space in the daytime. Notice these rooms here and here that actually open to the outside. Now this whole house might conceivably cover a block of territory, but there is no zoning in the first century. So there might be a little fast food shop here that's owned by the owner of the house, or maybe by a freed slave of the owner of the house. This might be a shoe shop or a leather shop or somewhere Paul would work. These little rooms here could easily be blocked off from the inside and open to the outside. So this is not just a house, this is a small community. And the richer the person, the greater the likelihood is that there would be this small community of slaves, freed slaves, and owners all living in close proximity. Give you some idea of what these things look like in actuality. This would be The front, so let me do this for you in order. This is the front door. And now walking in the front door, this is what the house would look like. So you're now in that little entryway where the doorkeeper would be. You see the little reflecting pond, and actually there's a skylight here. Now that was for two reasons. One, to let light into the house, another to let rain in. There's a little drain here in this reflecting pond that goes down the pond into a cistern, and you can see a little bit of a well there. So that was actually water for the house. The owner of the house would sit here on a throne, so when you're walking by, you would look through the beautiful house, see him sitting there. All of these walls and floors would be covered with either mosaics or frescoes. Give you a little bit better idea of what the house looked like. This is looking inside, then back outside. There's that reflecting pond again. You get to start seeing a little bit of an idea of how the walls were beautifully decorated. This is Pompeii, so 2,000 years after the fact, still see a little bit of color, still see some of the frescoes on the walls here. So highly decorated, highly stylized, a very impressive house. Going through the house, this is just another picture of that, the reflecting pond and some of the little buildings or walls on the side. Going through the house, let me go up here first. This would be a picture looking out in that peristyle, that garden, that park thing. So you can see it's surrounded on four sides by a breezeway. Again, very cultured, very ornate, and then a very formal garden in the middle. And then a final picture, just a little bit more of a close-up of the garden. You can get some idea of the size. This helped cool the house. This would be where the family would spend most of their time. Certainly in the summer, enjoying the breezes, whatever kind of breezes they were, in the shade, in the wintertime, and back in some of the covered areas, just trying to stay warm. So you see the houses in the first century were very, very impressive, and actually had some bearing on what we read in Corinth about the Lord's Supper and the Bible. Thank you for watching. This has been a little bit longer than a normal clip, and I would appreciate your feedback. I tried to integrate some pictures and some maps in here to give you a little more visual stimulation. So if this works better for you than just sort of the talking head, please let me know. The next thing I'm thinking about trying that I would appreciate your input on is some sort of narrated PowerPoint, probably over a 10 or 15 minute time period. So if you like this, let me know. If you didn't like it, let me know. And if the PowerPoint kind of thing sounds interesting, let me know about that. Again, the reason I'm doing this is for your benefit. If something's working, let me know. I'll do more of it. If something's not working, let me know, and I'll do my best to stop it. Thanks, and see you on the forums.